when I went to this boarding school for the gifted kids, it really opened me up intellectually to the world beyond our small town in every positive way. I was encountering new books, new ideas, and I wasn't afraid. In fact, I was curious. It whetted my curiosity more. But the turning point for me came when I was 17 years old. I was totally in love with Paris and European culture. When I was a really small boy, I had these two elderly aunts who lived in a cabin out there in the country in a pecan orchard. And they were so old. I call them my aunts, but they were actually the aunts of my grandmother. That's how old they were. They had been Red Cross nurses in World War One. When I was a little boy, I would go up there. This is before kindergarten. I would spend the day with them, and they would tell me about their years serving in France and traveling in Europe. And it just put this curiosity for wandering in me, this wanderlust. Well, they were gone by the time I was 17, they had passed, but I was still so curious to go to Paris and see where Hemingway lived in the art museums. My mother won a trip in a church raffle, a guided tour to Europe. She didn't want to go, but she knew I really did. And so she sent me, her 17-year-old son, the only young person on a bus full of elderly American tourists. I didn't care. I was going to Paris. The bus stopped on its way to Paris, an hour outside the city, to go look at an old church. Now, you can imagine restless 17-year-old American boy doesn't want to go dragging through another old church in Europe, but I did it anyway because who wants to sit on a bus for an hour? This was the cathedral at Chartres in France. And I didn't know this at the time growing up in small town South Louisiana in the late 20th century. But this cathedral, this Gothic medieval cathedral, is one of the great architectural wonders of the Western world. I walked into that place not knowing what to expect, and there I encountered God. Nothing had prepared me for the glory of God made manifest in the stones, the stained glass. I mean, it was just overwhelming. I was standing there overwhelmed by awe. And I remember standing there in the labyrinth. There's a famous labyrinth in a mosaic in the floor of the nave of the church. And I looked around and I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that God was real. And not only that he was real, but that he was personal, that he was calling me. Now, I wish I could tell you I walked out of that church as a Christian, but I didn't. I walked out of there, though, on a search because I couldn't unsee what I had seen. There was something, it wasn't an intellectual sort of thing. It was more what they call numinous or emotional, intuitional. But beyond that, God was there. And somehow he communicated to me, first of all, through the stones and the glass, through the material things. He communicated his presence, but also in my heart and in my imagination. I walked out of there into a new world. I couldn't tell you what else happened in Paris on that trip, but that's the thing I remember the most, that my journey towards a real faith in Christ began when I stumbled into that church as an arrogant teenager who thought he knew everything.